Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're having a great time, and I hope you're going to spoil yourself. Get yourself something lovely and warm and comforting to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. And this is part 2 of our story. It gets very, very exciting, so I hope you're prepared for it. So before we continue with our story, if you haven't heard the first part of it, click on the description because you really don't want to miss out. So let's get started with part 2 of our story. Mrs. Pennington. Unbeknown to Mr. Pennington, his wife Sadie was always checking up on her son Cole every day. She would ensure his truck was safely parked in the carport. She would snoop around the tennis pavilion to see if she could see any sign of him anywhere. She knew if anyone were to watch her tiptoeing around the place so surreptitiously, they'd think the woman was off her trolley. "I just need to be sure he's all right," she told herself. "What's wrong with that? I'm a mother, that's what we do. Sorry for caring so much, but I can't help myself. Besides, what Cole doesn't know won't hurt him. It's a mother's prerogative to look out for her son." Ever since Cole was a little boy, and he'd given her a scare at the supermarket, when he'd trotted out the store to feed the pigeons on a whim, and when he'd gone missing at the Boy Scouts camp, Mrs. Pennington always felt she needed to keep a steely eye on him. Even in his later teens, when her son had gone off on those solo camping trips, Mrs. Pennington had fought the sheets in her bed, wrestled with her nightmares, had been fraught with worry. She never shared her internal trepidation and grievous misgivings with her husband, as he would insist she was being ridiculous, far too overprotective of their son, very dramatic. But she was the one that had given birth to Cole. The intrinsic need to protect him from the moment he was born was all-consuming, and her husband could never really appreciate that. It was hard to let go of that nurturing instinct. Of course her husband was absolutely right. Cole was now 22 years old, but as a mother, Cole would always be her little boy, no matter what. Of course, if her husband was to know she was prying around the tennis pavilion with the stealth and cunning of a furtive robber, he wouldn't have been desperately impressed. On her clandestine snooping expeditions, of which there were many, she noticed the blonde girl that her son had brought over to the tennis pavilion over a dozen times, and ached to know if her son was in a relationship with this mysterious young lady. But she knew if she dared ask any questions, her prying would become all too evident. The cat that had arrived serendipitously in Cole's life had not been quite so serendipitous as Cole would have believed. It had all been part of a masterful plan from Mrs. Pennington's ingenious friend called Laura Atwood, who had encouraged her friend that getting Cole a cat that he thinks chose him as a companion would make it less likely for Cole to leave the tennis pavilion. Mrs. Pennington had nightmares of Cole going to a student's dig somewhere. Such a thought was too terrible to contemplate. How could she keep tabs on her son in such a chaotic environment like that? Laura confided to Sadie Pennington, in no uncertain terms, "All I'm saying, Sadie, that there is no doubt animals have incredible ways of keeping our children anchored to their homes. I know my Susie could not leave home for many years. She was far too attached to Snooky, you see, our beautiful little schnauzer, and as a result she stayed at our house indefinitely, so we had more fabulous years with our daughter under our roof. You mark my words, Sadie, if you get a domestic tabby for Cole from the shelter, just slip him or her into the tennis pavilion window, and if the cat settles down with Cole, so will your son. He'll be less inclined to leave the tennis pavilion, especially if he gets attached to the cat. From what I've learnt, a lot of student digs won't accept pets, so it'll be a no-brainer for your son to stay on your premises indefinitely." "You really think it'll work, Laura?" Sadie had asked. "Well, I know it worked with our daughter. I told her that if she wanted to be with Snooky, she had to stay on our premises. Believe me, she was champing at the bit to move into a student digs. She couldn't wait to leave home. But Snooky, well, she couldn't bear to be apart from him. I'm not saying it'll work for you, but the way I see it, animals have pulling power, and anything has got to be worth a try." Sadie sighed. "If my husband could hear us scheming like this, he would do his nut. I wasn't happy with Cole moving into the tennis pavilion, I have to say. You should have seen the place before it was cleaned up. It was a sight for sore eyes, let me tell you. It had been taken over by spiders. I even found a dead raccoon in one of the kitchen cabinets there. My husband was quick to remind me that Cole moving into the tennis pavilion was closer to home than a student digs, and I hasten to say, I keep snooping on him. You see, Cole, he's a free spirit, Laura. I worry that one day he'll take himself off on one of those adventurous jaunts, to never be seen again. I mean, think about those 411 cases. It's too dreadful to consider." "Don't go there, Sadie. You'll only eat yourself up with worry. Don't imagine anything that hasn't happened. The way I see it, your Cole is a sensible boy. He knows what he's doing. He's got a good head on those young shoulders of his, and he's not as callow as you might think." "Well, Laura, I've got a sneaky suspicion that Cole has a girlfriend," said Sadie discreetly. "Of course, I can't say a word about it, because if I mentioned the subject to him, he'd know I was spying on him, and you know that would go down like a lead balloon." "Well, that's great news, isn't it? A girl in his life? It'll make him much more inclined to settle down. What was she like?" "Well, it was hard to see, wasn't it? I mean, I was hiding in a bush, getting scratched to pieces, trying to peer through the foliage to have a close-up look at her. But the wretched leaves and the scratchy branches obscured my vision far too much. And if I jiggled the bush too much, I would likely have drawn unwanted attention to myself. I'm sure they would have noticed a wiggling bush, don't you think? I know Cole would be furious if he thought I was spying on him. But I did notice her blonde hair, it was long, her slender build, and pretty much nothing else, actually." Laura looked disappointed. "You could be describing 100 of university students that fit exactly the same profile. Not desperately exciting. Have you at least got a name for her, perhaps?" "No, I can't say I have." "Oh, my word, Sadie, you think you're a good sleuth, do you?" said Laura, scoffing. "Remind me never to hire your services if I ever think my husband is having an affair. He'd probably find you hiding in a bush himself, clicking away with your camera, wiggling the bush so much that everyone would observe you." "That's mean, Laura," Sadie had scolded. Sadie had learnt of an elderly lady who had died, devoted to her cat Marco Polo, and now the old woman was dead. Marco Polo had needed a brand new home, and so even before she had surreptitiously delivered Marco Polo to the tennis pavilion, when she'd spoken to her son on his cell phone every day, she kept saying, "Goodness gracious me, Cole, I don't know what's going on with me. I keep thinking of the name Marco Polo for some reason. It is rather peculiar. It keeps just popping up into my head like a cuckoo in a Swiss clock. Rather strange, don't you think?" "How extraordinary. That's a game, you know," her son had informed her. "It's a game you play in the swimming pool." "You do surprise me," his mother had said. "Actually, I think it's quite the most magnificent name for an animal. A domestic animal, perhaps. A cat in particular, don't you think, son?" "Mum," laughed Cole, "you do sometimes talk about the strangest, most peculiar things, if you don't mind my saying. All right, I admit that the name's got a ring to it. Marco Polo. Yes, it would be a good name for a cat." It had been 2 nights later, when with a cat basket in hand, Sadie had surreptitiously sneaked out at night towards the tennis pavilion. She could see her son watching some sport on television. He seemed to be quite animated by the score. Feeling confident that her son was sufficiently distracted, as he stood up from the couch and shrieked happily, telling the Colorado buffaloes that they had it in the bag. This was Sadie's quintessential opportunity to strike while the iron was hot, to slip Marco Polo into the open window of the tennis pavilion kitchenette, and then she watched and waited with bated breath. Things went better than she could have ever expected. Before long, the happy cat was curled up on her son's lap. She could see a contented expression sweep over her son's face as he stroked the cat. "Oh, my God! He's bitten the bait!" He wouldn't be leaving the tennis pavilion any time soon, she thought. When her son had strolled up to the house the following morning, she had acted surprised when he mentioned that a cat had moved in with him. "Would you believe it, Mother? He's so affectionate. He just strolled into the tennis pavilion, demanded to be fed. Then he lay on my lap, and I think he's here to stay. He's pretty much got his paws under the table." "Well, you know what they say, sweetheart. Cats choose their owners. He's clearly chosen you." Cole looked quite pleased by his mother's comments. "I think the cat's a keeper." "Well, he sounds quite wonderful. What are you going to call him?" "Well, it's rather amusing, actually, Mum. But the Marco Polo name you suggested the other day sort of remained in my head, I suppose. And I called the cat Marco Polo, and he seemed to like it. So I think I'm going to call him Marco Polo." "Well, it's a lovely name, isn't it?" said Mrs. Pennington, with a knowing twinkle in her eye. "Well, Mum, do you think I need cat litter? Stuff like that?" "Of course you do, sweetheart. But don't worry. I'll organise everything." "If you're sure," her son had said. "You're a star, Mum. I'll keep the windows closed for the time being. I don't want Marco Polo wandering off too far." "That's a very good idea," said his mother. 3 days later, Mrs. Pennington is very upset. She knows she should not get like this, but she can't help herself from worrying. It would seem that her son has disappeared off the face of the earth. Where is he? He'd normally give her a call on her cell phone every day, but he'd failed to call. His truck had not been collected from the dealership, as she discovered he should have picked it up 2 days ago after its servicing, but he had failed to show up. And then the mysterious blonde woman that she had observed through the bush the other day, who was clearly a girlfriend of her son's, had shown up at her front doorstep, confirming her very worst fears. "Hello, Mrs. Pennington," she had said, stretching out her hand to give it a shake. "You don't know me. I'm a good friend of Cole's. My name is Brandy MacPherce. I'm just very concerned about the whereabouts of your son Cole. I don't want to alarm you, but I haven't been able to get in touch with him. I can't get through to him at all on his cell phone. I don't know if you've seen him, but I don't know where he is. I'm very troubled because he hasn't been in touch with me, and it's not like him." The young woman burst into tears, and Mrs. Pennington led her into her house and got her to take a seat on the upholstered slide-in bench of the breakfast nook. "How long have you been seeing my son, Brandy?" she asked the young woman. "About 9 months. "Oh, my son is such a dark horse. He's never mentioned you. It's so typical of him. He just wasn't ready to introduce me to you guys yet, but I'm glad to have met you now. I'm so worried. I have no idea where he could have got to. He didn't show up for classes. No one has seen him around the campus. He didn't pick his truck up from the dealers after it was serviced. So something has gone awry. He told me about his new cat, Marco Polo. He'd never have abandoned his new pet." "I will level with you, Brandy," says Mrs. Pennington, her hands quivering. "I'm worried sick myself about my son. He always tells me to keep my nose out of his business. I try not to pry on him, I really do, but I've noticed he's not been around lately. I've been taking care of that cat of his, giving it a lot of attention, and I have to say there are no signs of life in that tennis pavilion, which is very curious indeed." "When did you last see him?" "Well, in truth, it was about 3 days ago." "Something's off," says Brandy. "I can smell it. I feel it in my guts. We need to call the police." It was 15 minutes later that 2 police officers came to the front door to ask questions, and Mr. Pennington, who was busy at the computer, had glanced out of the window briefly when he heard the swoosh of tyres crunching the gravel outside the house. He was more than a little perturbed. "What have you done, Sadie?" he mumbled under his breath, feeling the annoyance surfing through his veins. Why didn't his wife listen to him? She knew that Cole could take off at a moment's notice, but he guessed his wife had reported him missing. She had kept dropping random hints that she was rather worried about their maverick son, who was perfectly capable of looking after himself, thank you very much. His wife was embarrassing herself, calling the police around like this on a wild goose chase, giving the poor men a wasted journey. His son was the carbon copy of his own father, and if he had $1 for every time the police had been called to investigate his father's disappearance over the years, he'd be a very rich man indeed. He watched curiously as the 2 police officers climbed out of their truck. One of them was adjusting his holtie as he straightened up his back. They ambled towards the front door, with an air of urgency in their demeanour. Mr. Pennington sighed. "Oh, my wife," he sighs again, a frustration irking his sense of calm. "Why won't she ever listen to me? I'm going to have to fix up this mess." He closes his study door behind him, gliding down the ornate sweeping staircase to meet the 2 policemen in the entrance hall. "What's going on, officers?" he asked, his mouth turning downwards into a scowl, as he glanced at his wife, who's refusing to meet his gaze. She's standing next to a blonde-haired young lady, who seems equally as distressed. "I've called these very nice officers over to the house, darling. You see, I'm very worried about our son Cole. He's completely vanished. No one knows where the hell he's got to. I'm so terribly worried about him. No one has a clue where he is." "Sweetheart," said Mr. Pennington, "you know what our son is like. He's an intrepid adventurer by nature, just like my father was, spontaneously going off to explore the wilderness. He's possibly on the Colorado Trail for a couple of days, even as I speak. What have you got yourself so heated about?" His wife does not answer him, as she leads the officers into the living room. Mrs. Pennington encourages them to take a seat on one of her luxurious white leather couches in her illustrious living room, with its wide-open fireplaces and ornate wooden panelling. Officer Brad Kinter was a kindly man, with a masculine square jawline and very dark, deep-set eyes that were as sharp as a button. The other man, Officer Tristan Reedhead, was sitting next to the senior officer, stoically listening while taking down notes, with his long, slender, artistic hands that looked as if they would be better served behind an artist's canvas than taking down police notes. "So let me get this right, Mr. Pennington. Are you saying that your son Cole is rather inclined to go off on his own from time to time? Is he a bit of an adventurer?" "Exactly," said Mr. Pennington. "It's in his nature to do so. My father was exactly the same, disappearing for days on end. When daily life got on top of him, he needed a break, but he never informed anyone where he was going. The police were constantly visiting our farmhouse to file a plethora of missing persons reports. My father would always return to the house a couple of days later. I'm afraid my son Cole is inclined to be the same. We have tried to teach him the importance of letting us know when he's going off somewhere, but he's not that reliable in this regard. I'm quite sure he will show up any time soon." "I'm so sorry to intrude, officer, but I do need to correct you, Mr. Pennington. With the greatest of respect, I know where you're coming from, and I do agree that your son is a maverick spirit. But even so, I do know him. I'm Brandy, his girlfriend, and I just know he wouldn't bog off like this. He's also just got a new cat, and he hasn't phoned me at all for days. I'm very worried." "So you believe your boyfriend's absence is out of character?" Officer Brad Kinder asked Brandy, stroking his chin reflectively. "Yes, I do, officer. I really do. Granted, I know that Mr. Pennington has known his son far longer than I have done, but truly something's off here. I can smell a rat instinctively. I know my boyfriend is the adventurous type. I don't deny that. He loves his own company, enjoys solo camping trips. But he told me himself he knows his mother is the most dreadful warrior, so he couldn't disappear for days, as that wouldn't be a kind thing to do. He'd have to contact her first. Besides, I'd kill him myself if he just bogged off without telling me where he was going." "So you've tried to contact him?" "There's no answer on his cell phone, officer. It just goes straight to voicemail." "And you, Mrs. Pennington, do you agree with Mrs. Macpherce here, that your son is missing?" "Oh, I do, officer. I do. My husband here thinks I'm a drama queen, with very good reason. I'm a protective mother. I know my son has wandered off from time to time, but he's 22 now, much more responsible and assertive. I do not believe for a moment he would have abandoned his girlfriend, his cat, and not informed me as to where he was going."
"And you, Mr. Pennington?" asked Officer Bradkinter. "What is your opinion in regards to this matter? Now you have heard your wife and your son's girlfriend voice their concerns. Do you still believe there is no reason to worry about his disappearance?" "Officer, I'm not God. I don't have a crystal ball. But I know my son as I knew my father, and they were cut from the same cloth. My father never meant to be rude, bogging off into the sunset in the way he did. He really didn't. What he did was so spontaneous. It never occurred to him the distress he was causing. He'd throw a backpack over his shoulders and disappear into the bush for a few days, when he wanted to get away from it all. So tell me, Brandy, has your boyfriend been stressed lately?" the officer asked her. "Overwhelmed by anything?"
"Yes, he's been worried about some of the college projects he's had to complete. He said they were tearing his hair out. There was so much stuff he had to do. He did express frustration, but I don't believe for a single moment that he couldn't overcome those hurdles. I mean, surely a little stress at college is easy to overcome."
"Not for everyone, Mrs. Macpherce. Sorry, Miss Macpherce," said Officer Bradkinter. "Some people, when they can't cope, there is no telling what they're capable of doing."
"Officer, I hope you're not suggesting what I think you might be implying," blurted Mrs. Pennington. "My son is not the kind of boy that would top himself. Never. If things got on top of him, he just wouldn't do it. My husband is absolutely right. He would more than likely just bog off for a few days. But hurt himself, definitely not. He would never do that."
"Mrs. Pennington, I put it to you theoretically that your son is very overwhelmed with his coursework at the moment. He could have been distracted, in a distressed state of mind, rather overwhelmed, so he failed to let anyone know where he was going. He needed to get away. Perhaps he's a chip off his grandfather's block. So it's likely that this is what he might have done. I just need you to appreciate that this is a real possibility. Your son is 22 years old, and I'm sure a very capable young man. And as your husband wisely suggests, he could have easily wandered off for a while. In other words, he could walk through this door even as I speak."
"Officer, I don't mean to be rude, but you have no idea what you're talking about. You really need to take what I'm telling you seriously. Let me make my position with you absolutely clear. My husband may think my son has gone away for a few days, but I don't. Something's off. I want you to do your level best to find him for me. I'm of the opinion that he's landed up in some kind of trouble. He needs our help." "Officer, why has my son not picked up his truck from the dealership? Why has he not phoned his girlfriend or me? And why has he not looked in on his cat?"
"Rest assured, Mrs. Pennington, we will do everything in our power to locate the whereabouts of your son. We will make the necessary inquiries on the Colorado Continental Divide Trail if anyone has seen a young man fitting his description hiking. We will check his withdrawals from the bank, check he hasn't taken any local flights anywhere, search the tennis pavilion, and, of course, the whole property. We'll scan it all, see if we can get any answers for you."
"Thank you, officers. I really appreciate this," she'd said to the two men.
"No trouble, madam. I'm just doing my job. But if I may give you a word of advice, I would say keep calm during this time. Many people on missing persons investigations reappear. So don't waste your energy brooding or getting very upset until you have good reason to do so."
"Thank you, officer. You've been most kind," she'd said gratefully. Mrs. Pennington was furious when the police had left the house. Her husband had been so nonchalant and dismissive about her son's disappearance. "Why the hell did you act so nonchalant? How could you?" she barked at her husband, not caring that Brandy was witness to their altercation.
"What are you talking about, sweetheart?"
"You have the audacity to undermine me and Brandy here.
You keep insisting our son has just taken off into the sunset. Now, thanks to you, they're not going to take this missing persons investigation very seriously."
"I better go," said Brandy, looking rather uncomfortable.
"Keep me posted, Mrs. Pennington, if you have any updates."
"Will do so." Cole's account. I knew I'd fallen down a long hole and banged my head as I'd hit the bottom of something very hard. There were times I'd almost wake up, but not quite. The only way I can describe the feeling is being so heavily drugged from an anaesthetic, and for a while you're aware of things going on around you, but then you slip down and down that long river of oblivion all over again. On one occasion I could hear two people shuffling around me. I assumed they were people, but they seemed very large. They spoke in a strange language together, trying to keep their voices low. At one time they appeared to be having an argument. Was I in a hospital, I wondered? Had someone rescued me from the deep hole I'd fallen down? I so wanted to communicate, sit up and speak out for myself, but I was locked up in this dark void that made it impossible to break through the dense, murky veil. Something or someone was turning my body around, putting a heavy blanket on me that felt different to blankets I'm normally accustomed to. I didn't smell the anaesthetic smells you would smell in a hospital, nor did I hear trolleys or the tinkling of cutlery that you would expect. Instead, I smelt the smells of earth and moss. I told myself I must be in a singular hospital ward, and the two nurses looking after me were huge. How I knew this, I didn't know. Sometimes I'd feel a wet hand cupping my face. My head was resting on a very comfortable cushion that smelt of moss. Something kept dabbing the back of my head. There seemed to be always someone keeping a vigil over me. I remember the earnest conversations, the arguments, the constant turning of my body, and attending to my head wound. I also felt something being slipped into my hands that felt like a stick of some kind, but it was pleasingly warm to the touch. I do remember spasms of warm electricity riding through my body. In truth, I assumed it was some kind of high-tech procedure being used in the hospital to lift me out of my catatonic dissociation and mental withdrawal from reality, from which I was desperately trying to awaken. I was trying to fight it, and the only way I can describe it to you is falling into a frozen lake, and all you can see is an icy wall above your head. You're desperate to break through that icy wall, to get to the surface to breathe again, but you cannot find a way out. That was how I felt, in this peculiar catatonic kind of state. At one point in time I did sit up, and I found myself staring at this huge ambiguous creature with a human face. She towered at about 7 to 8 feet tall, was burly and stockily built, looking at me through deep-set, dark, treacle-coloured eyes that registered great concern. But as she moved over towards me, my fatigued eyes that could barely stay open slipped into the empty, vacant limbo of my dreams. I remember thinking, bloody hell, was that real or not? What was that thing I saw? A hairy human lady built like a giant. I do remember, quite a long time later, although I can't be sure how long, there was a point when the excitement around me seemed to reach a fever pitch. It sounded like there were 4 foreign people chattering about me very excitedly, as if they were very pleased about something. Then I felt myself being hauled into powerful arms, and after that I remember nothing at all until I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by an ocean of questions that I simply was not capable of answering. Everything was so blurry, so incredibly confusing. The doctor came in to see me. He informed me that I had taken a very large bang to the head, and my brain had been bruised, but I would make a full recovery.
"You've been unconscious for about 5 days, I suspect. 2 days here, and 2 days spent in the woodgrove on your property, where you were found by the sniffer dogs that were looking for you. You were found lying under a large oak tree there. What I want to know is how you managed to remain unconscious for 3 days under an oak tree, without being taken advantage of by the local wildlife, scavengers, so to speak, like coyotes."
"I don't think I was under a tree. I think I fell down this long hole," I told him.
"I was informed you were found lying unconscious under this tree. Furthermore, your open head wounds look as if they'd been treated by a herbal poultice. I'm of the opinion that you were not under that tree for 3 days, as you say. Someone has helped you. But who? That is the $1,000,000 rather intriguing question. Sorry, Doctor, you've lost me. What is a herbal poultice? I don't understand. Well, it's like what they did in the days of Socrates. They'd make poultices out of natural herbs to heal the wounds. I have to say, someone with an ancient knowledge has been making you a very good poultice indeed. I'm a big believer in natural medicine myself. Some of it is far more effective than the alternative therapies we use today. The trouble is the big pharmaceutical industry cannot patent anything that comes from nature, so there is no big money to be made in sourcing materials that come from the natural world. More's the pity, let me tell you. But I daren't make my opinions known. I'll be struck off as a doctor, if I did. Needless to say, I placed the poultice into a little container. I sent it to a friend of mine who is a herbalist. She says she can't identify many of the herbs, which she has never ever seen before. But she says whoever put the poultice together on you knew what they were doing. They have an advanced knowledge that is lacking in our society today. I hasten to say there is no inflammation. Your head injury is improving stupendously, but you really have no idea who treated you. They did a sterling job. I'm incredibly impressed. No, I don't, I said, looking at the doctor bemused, and remembering the time I'd smelt moss and earth around me, people speaking in a strange language, and the presence of 2 very large nurses. Doctor, do you have any staff working for you that are foreign and very, very big? I asked him. What do you mean, foreign? What do you mean, big? Well, speaking a strange language. Well, we have other nationalities working in the hospital, of course, but they always speak English in the hospital. And what do you mean by big? I just got the impression that someone foreign was watching over me. He was very big, or she was very big. You know, tall, muscular. The only one that would fit that description is Terry Mullingry, but he works in pediatrics. He wouldn't have attended to you, that's for sure. The man is a beefcake, let me tell you. I mean, he's big, possibly 6 foot tall, weighs over 250 pounds. A strapping lad he is. He's involved in all the heavyweight lifting and stuff, but he's not foreign. He's from Pennsylvania. No, I'm talking about someone much bigger than that. Much bigger. The doctor's eyes almost pop open. How big are we talking about? Asked the doctor. I don't know. About 8 foot tall, I suppose. The doctor chuckled. No, it's your mind playing tricks on you, young man. Do you know anyone who's 8 foot tall? I don't think so. Unless we're talking about the tallest man in the world. His name was Robert Waslow, I believe. He grew so tall due to the issues with his pituitary gland. He continued to grow as an adult. He died at about your age. You're 22, are you not? I nodded. I saw a picture of the man. Normal people came up to about the top of his legs, you know. I believe his weight reached 439 pounds. He was very skinny, you know. Can you imagine that? Imagine never being able to stop growing. Let's just say his foot size reached a whopping 1 foot, 6.5 inches. Very big. When the cheerful, upbeat doctor had left my side, I was left feeling rather bemused and nonplussed. It would seem that something had been caring for me, after I'd fallen down that long hole, hitting my head on the ground below. But what and who had been taking care of me? How had they managed to rescue me and to treat my head wound with a poultice that had left a herbalist stumped? It was incredulous. It was then that I remembered the dark, indeterminate, ambiguous figure of my dreams, that had seemed so vague, so hazy, so shadowy. Were they part of my dream, or had they actually been real? When I returned home, my mother insisted on waiting on me at the tennis pavilion, and my girlfriend visited me regularly. It seemed she and my mother had developed a strong bond and had hit it off. I noticed my father was in the dog box with my mother, who kept giving him "I told you so" looks. Thank God I called the police, said my mother. "If those sniffer dogs had not found you, God only knows what would have become of you. We could have been burying you by now. The officers are astonished you survived 3 days under an oak tree without being devoured by opportunists like mountain lions or coyotes. Your father was most insistent that you had bogged off into the sunset without a bye or leave, like your grandfather would have done. Indeed, your father almost got the police to buy his story, but I put my foot down, I did. Didn't I, Brandy, dear?" my mother said, rolling her eyes at the back of her head and giving my bashful-looking father some rather victorious, smug looks. My father stood there like a sorrowful dog that had been told off by the owner for stealing the fillet steak and was looking very disgruntled. But my mother didn't care. She enjoyed having the last word for once. "That's right," said Brandy. "Your mother was absolutely amazing, Co. She got the police out there, and the sniffer dogs, they found you." "Well, I'm very glad to be back. But just for the record, Dad, I am a free spirit like your father was. But if I do go missing in the future, I probably genuinely am missing. I'd never not inform you about my whereabouts. I know it would upset Mother greatly, especially not after this incident." "Good. I'm glad to hear that, son. Very glad." "Mum, quit giving Dad such a hard time, will you, over what happened? I'm here now. Surely that is what counts." "You're right, son, about that. But I would never have heard the end of it if the boot had been on the other foot and you had come waltzing in. So I think I'm rather entitled to have a little bit of fun." "I can see that Marco Polo is very pleased to have you back, I have to say, son." "The feeling is mutual, Mum. I really am very fond of that cat. It's amazing how he sauntered into my life, marking me as his own. I feel quite honoured, actually." "Well, the cat's obviously got great taste, hasn't he? You do realise that most of those student digs don't take animals, from what I've heard," said my mother. "You wouldn't want poor Marco Polo to be homeless, so I guess you're stuck at the tennis pavilion indefinitely. Mrs. Pennington, believe me, the tennis pavilion is paradise compared to student digs." "I know," said Brandy, interceding. "I doubt your son would ever want to leave the tennis pavilion. It's so cool in there." "Glad to hear it," my mother said, purring to herself more loudly than Marco Polo. But if anyone heard her, no one said a word. 2 weeks later, I'm lying in my bed in the tennis pavilion. I hear a strange knock on my window. It sounds like a branch beating against it, but it certainly got my attention, and I sat up. I noticed that Marco Polo's eyes were fixed on the window, like 2 opulent yellow sapphires, shining brightly. The knocking sound persisted, so curiously I climbed out of the bed. It was a bright summer's night. The weather was warm and congenial, but the oakwood floor was cool on my feet. I slipped them into my slippers and grabbed my torch and walked around the tennis stadium. There was no wind blowing. Nothing was there, but something had knocked at my window. I was certain of it. It had felt and sounded deliberate. I got the overwhelming sense I was not alone, and that something was watching me. But as my torchlight scanned the fence of the tennis court, along with the distant woodgrove, I could see absolutely nothing, and I wasn't satisfied. My curiosity had been ruffled like a pigeon's feathers. My senses were alert, like a snake's flicking tongue when it senses its prey. As strange as it may sound, I felt as if in my mind a distant voice was calling me from a long way away. It was not a voice that belonged to me. It sounded like it came from another world. The experience was so extraordinarily bizarre that I couldn't return to the safe confines of the tennis stadium. I was actually so enamoured by this. It seemed so peculiar. Something was going on, but I couldn't fathom what. Some mysteries need solving, and this was one of them. I walked over to the back of the tennis court, behind the fence that was overgrown by a tangle of wild rambling shrubbery, from wisteria, roses, honeysuckle and jasmine. The tennis floor was asphalt paving. It had been broken apart. Patches of grass had plundered audaciously through the ground, conquering the asphalt's fixative hold.
and that was when I saw the white pebbles my mother used in one of her botanical arrangements that led directly in a long vertical line into the woodgrove, as if they were meant to be followed. My thoughts were, what the heck? But I followed the trail nevertheless, and there she was, welcoming me with her warm, treacle-coloured eyes. And I knew at once, without even a hesitant doubt, that this was the ambiguous creature that had taken care of me when I had that nasty fall. To my surprise, another reticent creature moves from beyond the trees to join her friend. They look uncannily so alike. They could be sisters, covered in long flowing dark hair, with pyramid-shaped heads and deep-set dark treacle eyes. I knew at once they were Bigfoot. Perhaps deep down in my gut I'd always known this, but I wasn't prepared to admit it to myself, as some truths can be difficult to digest. The less reticent of the two creatures talks to me, in a language that I remember hearing from when I'd been under their charge. The language was automatically translated into my head like magic. Akila koshafana, hilo bogalina, ajagalaswa. I just want to make sure you're better. You had a nasty fall. We filled in the hole, so it won't happen to you again. You looked after me when I had that accident. I don't know how to thank you, I said. Iko poshafisa, ho pokelina kasha, avulinali logolona, silawana. In the beginning we couldn't move you, as you were in a bad place, but we watched over you. When we heard the people and the dogs looking for you, we brought you out of the hole. I just wanted you to know that I wasn't part of your dreams. I was real, and I am real. I don't know what to say, apart from thank you. Ikitato omokocha. It's only a pleasure. I like your energy. What do you mean, you like my energy? I asked the Bigfoot. Opishakilanin, avoligalana, hilo shogola. Your energy is wild like the eagles. You've always wanted to fly. I always have great respect for the intrepid explorer. Now that I know you're well, I'll leave you. I watched agog as the two Bigfoots glided away, glancing over their shoulders at me. They swung their arms backwards and forwards as they moved, with the grace of a ballerina, and when they ran through the woodgrove, they almost floated away. To cut a long story short, I married my girlfriend Brandy. The tennis pavilion was transformed into a fabulous farmhouse. We now raise our children on the property. One day my daughter told me a big hairy lady had given her a stone. It's for you! The hairy lady told me that you must never ever forget. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.